All right. I'm here as a well, I have as a guest today Dr. Melissa Chapple. Is it Chapple?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's want to make sure. Extra P, I don't know if it would affect the manner in which it's said. I have no idea. But in any case, I have her here today to discuss hopefully some research, some ideas regarding some of their own efforts in regarding pertaining to like autism advocacy, autism related research within their own field of interest and their own you know well, before I just start butchering what it is that your credentials are, go ahead and if you do not mind, tell them a little bit about what your like job is or whatever.
Okay, that's going to be quite hard because academia means my job is constantly changing. But
Yeah. Well, we can go as vague as possible, whatever works.
okay. So I'm an autistic adult, and that's kind of why I do everything that I do. Very, very generally, I work across mental health and neurodivergent conditions as a psychology researcher who moves kind of between departments. So between English, sociology, I try and kind of blend different departments together to explore from different angles the experiences of divergent minds, I suppose is the best way to summarize the different people I work with.
That's a nice way to put it, right? Oh, okay.
But yeah,
I
sorry,
thought
I didn't know.
no, I thought you were gonna like keep telling me like, okay, so what are your essentially like just so they have an understanding, what are your credentials? Your PhD in so on and
Okay, so my background was psychology, so I done a bachelor's and a master's in psychology, and then I done my PhD, which was kind of drawing on the principles of both psychology and English literature, exploring what reason fiction can do, so how it can challenge stereotypes about autistic people if we use that as a methodology in research. So if we compare the way people read. And also trying to create social spaces where autistic and non-autistic people can interact together empathetically without kind of stereotyping and stigma getting in the way as it ordinarily does in typical everyday communication.
and I'm guessing it has more to do with creating a balance in such communication and not trying to cater to say just entirely normative needs for them adapting to an environment that they're expected to or something like that, right? It's more of an effort towards creating some kind of a communication, I don't want to call it communication related equity or balance or whatever, but you know what I'm trying to say, I think. Now I have to ask this: why autism for you? Why advocacy more specifically, right? Because you could do research on the subject, you can do all sorts of things, right? But you wouldn't necessarily have to be like, oh, I want to be an advocate for it, right? So advocacy kind of involves a more slightly, I guess, what would be considered a more activist role in the sense that you're being outwardly outspoken about your sort of social opinions on the matter and ideas, and you're trying to use some of your research to sort of say, hey, some of these things need to change, some of these things are a problem. Why that side of things for you?
I think in summary, that's obviously more personal. So when I work in mental health, I mean, I do have mental health conditions as well. I have PTSD. So obviously some of the people I work with I might be able to relate to, but not all of them will have the same experiences as me. But I'm very interested in being an ally and kind of advocating on behalf of people who are kind of really poorly understood within psychology. Um, but I think for my PhD, it was important to me to do something that felt really personal, and autism in particular, there's been heavy amounts of research since like the 1940s when it became introduced in clinics, and it's just so badly understood. There's so much stigma inbuilt in theory and in research, and the findings are often not understood through the lens of a neurodivergent person. And I say that because it's not even just that, it's not an autistic perspective, it's a very normative perspective that kind of
So
looks
you're
at the
saying
data
that
all the
the
time.
research itself that you've obviously studied and gone over, and the literature you've gone over in preparation for the type of work you like to do, um, is lacking, for lack of a better word, because of these sort of biases or normative kind of perspectives that are being applied or lensed through and when doing such research. Is that kind of what you're saying there?
Yes, there's like a normalization agenda that you can see through a lot of the dominant like theory and the research that has come out of that, where it's very much how can we take autistic people and make them seem more quote unquote normal, and the practices have been so extremely harmful that we now see higher rates of all mental health conditions across autistic people. The most common cause of death for autistic people is death by suicide. So this is like a real big issue that is building over time. That felt really important to kind of come in and completely change the perspective, because there are other people arguing, you know, that we should include autistic people and we should treat them well. But I think at its essence, people are quite neatly in their ways of thinking about conditions like autism. And I think by drawing on another discipline entirely, like English, like getting people to feel together through a text that they've read together, can really kind of broaden your mind and make you go, oh, well, I'm reading about that person and they've actually kind of approached that in a way that I'm feeling in response to that.
Yeah. So I just want to tie, just in case somebody is watching this that isn't familiar with my own work and they're here to probably listen to whatever you're saying. Just very quickly, I'm an advocate myself, but I'm obviously advocating more on what I consider to be the schizo-spectrum side of things, which can include everything from schizoid, which is my deal, schizotypal, schizophrenic, schizoaffective, schizophreniform. There's like a lot of forms of this sort of stuff, and there's a lot of conflation between a lot of things. So so in the work that I do, I'm trying to kind of change the perspective as well, right? The stigma, the assumptions that are made regarding people like this, right? What is the general assumption of someone that is on the schizo spectrum? Is that they're crazy, they don't make sense, they're rambling, they're like, they're possibly dangerous. They get mixed in with things like psychosis itself as well, gets mixed in with psychotic, right? Which it's its own problems. And I know autism in itself has had a very long history, a very tragic history pertaining to how a lot of this research that you actually went into was initially collected, right? Like a lot of the research that that was accumulated over the last century or so has been a dark path in a variety of ways. And I know that as people that are trying to advocate now, it's a hard thing to do, to kind of reverse that many decades of misunderstanding, misattribution, and so on. But that makes me want to roll into what your actual work is, or the research that you did. Now, the title of this piece of research is, and I love it because it's a mouthful, exploring the different cognitive, emotional, and imaginative experiences of autistic and non-autistic adult readers when contemplating serious literature as compared to non-fiction. Now, to me, that sounds pretty cohesive, but I know that that is also an attempt at making a title that makes sure to get every little bit of context it can into what it is that it's trying to do. But I'd like to allow you to please explain to me what this research is, what it intended to do, what your goals were, and what it ultimately sort of culminated into.
So just to start with, yeah, I am phenomenally bad with titles. It's like, how do I narrow it down? What are the key messages?
I know, I'm the same way. It's like, okay, that's as narrow as it could get, right?
Yeah.
Like for you, like it could have been like a paragraph.
Yeah.
But yeah, I get you. But go ahead. Tell us a little bit about what the work you did, and how you went about it. You could talk about everything from methods to just you know, essentially goals, or I'm hoping the goals were just merely to collect data and see what it is, not a goal or some preset goals, right? We don't do that in any kind of scientific work. So go right ahead.
So I mean, it's quite complicated in that sense of why the data was collected. So going back to kind of what my PhD was, there's kind of there's probably many ways, but there's two main ways you can do a PhD. So you can kind of write it as a book where like each chapter is very thematic, and maybe data's cutting across different chapters, or you can do a traditional scientific article and that's your chapter. So that's how I did mine. It was like 4, I think, should know, different pieces of research that all tied together. So in the very, very beginning, there was like an interview study where it was just collecting data for the sake of understanding how autistic people read and why they read and what they get out of it compared to non-autistic people. So that was the kind of first bookend of the PhD, and this was the last. So this was the thing that kind of came out of everything else. So I mean, I know I've spoke to you about the double empathy paper we done, which was where we actually brought autistic and non-autistic people together in pairs, and they read Of Mice and Men separately. But they filled out kind of a reading diary, which was quite open. We added some questions for prompts, but they could write what they wanted. And then they came together for 4 weeks to discuss that. And what, just kind of briefly for the context, what we found out of that is that people who would come in seeing each other as essentially different, you know, the autistic people worried about being stereotyped and kind of expecting that, I suppose. And the non-autistic people expecting these autistic people are going to be different from us in a way. There was a very kind of othering process that had gone on just from the get-go. They suddenly saw one another as essentially similar, like friends, just interacting and taking things from a book and feeling through that together. The empathy that came out was astounding. I think was it, even though it's what we would have hoped to found, we were very shocked by that. When I say we, there was a team that kind of a big team that kind of narrowed down in papers differently, where I had a diverse range of perspectives. So some autistic people, some non-autistic people looking at the data, analyzing the data. So for this paper, I think where we started from then was, well, what happens when people read alone about different kinds of minds? And there's, so in English literature, specifically the Reader Organisation, which draws upon the principles of English literature in the UK, they argue that if a text is being read aloud, then it kind of creates an actual imaginative space in a room for people to move through together, where kind of a feeling can come up organically. You know, we spoke about it briefly before we started recording, that sometimes, you know, you're not necessarily focused on the sequential events in a story, but you might feel moved by something, you know, something might catch your attention as you're going. And the argument is, if it's being read aloud, then it's easier to sort of spontaneously engage with the text that way. But we'd seen concerns from autistic people in our first study that the idea of being read aloud to by someone who then inevitably has a bit of power in that social dynamic could be a problem. So
yeah, absolutely.
We adapted the method. I think we had 8 different texts that ranged across like classic literature, modern literature, which was like from 2010 onwards, and some non-fiction from first-person perspective and from like so-called expert perspective. And then half of those texts were about autistic experiences, or what we deemed to feel like autistic experiences, because obviously classic literature, there's no mention of autism directly, but
of course,
you
but
can sort of feel it.
there's like for MySpace, in my opinion, one of those pieces of classic literature that can be relatable to a lot of the schizoids is a book called No Longer Human. So if you've never read that, I recommend it.
No, I'm really keen to read that.
No, it's good stuff. It's very depressing, but it's good. It was a Japanese author, and I can't recall his name right now, because I'm terrible. But anyway, continue. Sorry.
That's okay. So yeah, and then half of the text we just chose to be quite, I suppose, generically relatable to anybody, you know, covering things like happiness or anxiousness, things that any human should be able to take something from. And we were curious, kind of, you know, would the autistic people find a particular kind of text they got the most out of that, and vice versa? You know, how would it be for non-autistic people reading about autistic minds? Would that be similar to what we saw when they actually interacted with autistic people? So what it kind of, I think the main finding that came out of that is the things that people took overall across the texts. from their reading experiences. So the kind of that problematic early theory that we've been alluding to, and some of the modern theory that was drawn on that, I think would probably expect autistic people to be what they call quite rote. So to be turning up with, wanting to extract data, like, oh, I can use this for a social situation in the future, so I'm going to just store that quite neatly and create like a social script or schema from that. And the reverse is what we saw. So we saw that the non-autistic people do that, and they kind of like to have conclusions. So they like to come out with a sort of a neat message, I suppose. So this happened in that book, or I felt this in that book, and so this means that. And they would try and be already thinking about kind of how can I use that in the future in my social interactions, which obviously has advantages, because what that means is they're reducing that information down into a neat package, so their brain's not overloaded with the amount that they're storing. But it also means that they've got something that if they're in a fast-paced interaction the next day, they might be able to draw on that usefully. Obviously, our data collection stopped after talking to them, just after the reading experience. I think it was 2 weeks later. So I have no way of knowing how useful that ended up, but theoretically, those are the advantages there.
Yeah, that's actually, you skipped ahead without even knowing it. There was a question I had regarding the practical. What you perceive to be the practical or pragmatic? Let's just say if we applied them to, I don't know, something like the workplace or academia or something, right? What are some of the benefits of the manner in which a non-autistic person interacts with text and interprets and sort of considers the information within, and the manner in which an autistic person does? And what are your thoughts on what would it be conducive toward? Maybe what type of research, what type of work, what type of what usefulness is there in that, in such manners of interpreting text? That's what
So in relation to my research, I should probably add some nuance and just explain that it was qualitative, which means it was textual data. So people filled out questionnaires, we spoke to people at interview. It wasn't like a great big study that was representative.
No, I'm not claiming anything, what's it called, prescriptive.
No, I know, but that will probably then influence what I'm about to say, because obviously I am making an assumption that other non-autistic people might think this way. So for us, that finding shows that it is possible for non-autistic people to think in that kind of quite rote, neat way, but it doesn't mean everybody will, of course. But if we go with the assumption that maybe that might be why typically non-autistic people and autistic people think differently. So we know they think differently. We know that there's some cognitive differences. We don't know exactly what those are. But if it is that autistic people stick with detail and kind of remain really engaged imaginatively in what they've read, and non-autistic people have kind of taken away key messages, then I suppose what we would expect is that non-autistic people might, I'm not just drawing on research here, I'm drawing on like other people's theories, like the double empathy problem.
We saw everyone, if you want to see the sources, they're all there. They're all there.
That helps a lot.
A lot of them. There's a lot of sources. Go ahead.
Then I assume non-autistic people would probably, they'd be better interacting with other non-autistic people in fast-paced communication. So if you think about like a typical office job, the kind of communication that happens, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. And that quick, like everything's moving at such a rapid pace, and you're supposed to know what the other person wants you to say and when they want you to say it. They do quite well with that, but the disadvantage of that kind of way of interacting is that you don't really get the depth. So for example, you don't know exactly what a person's thinking or feeling because you've not let them explore that with you. You've really narrowed it down into what social interaction should look like. And unfortunately, the way lives are built is in favor of that kind of interaction style. Where autistic people do much better when it's not fast-paced and there's room to really kind of
explore,
think through something and theorize about the nuances that might be going on for somebody. So you often hear people say autistic people can't perspective take, and what I would say is we can't perspective take quickly some of the time, but we're constantly thinking things like, well, I don't know what that person is thinking because I don't know what kind of day they've had, or I don't know what other things might be happening right now that's affecting them in real time. And
Yeah,
it goes
yeah,
quite specific where like,
yeah.
you know, I don't know if that person's upset because I have no idea. Like,
Maybe they just didn't have breakfast that morning.
yeah, exactly.
Maybe they're thinking about something that they bothered them yesterday, and they haven't had breakfast, and
Exactly.
and they stubbed their toe this morning, and they got into a fight with their partner. There's like all this culmination of the context, right? That isn't
And then
being
add to
included.
that the
Mhm.
fact that we know people lie a lot. Just because someone tells me they're okay doesn't mean they're okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I can imagine a situation in which somebody will say, "I'm okay," and if the autistic person just takes it at face value, they go, "Oh, okay, that's good."
Yeah.
And that's it, right? Like, that's good. I'm glad you're okay, right? And then, of course, misunderstandings of such a reaction would be, if somebody says, "I'm okay," right? It's just going to be like, well, they're okay. And then it's going to be like, oh, that person's, what's the word? Insensitive to what obviously is a very sad person. And it's like, no, you said you were okay. Enough said. And so that requires more context, right? It's easier to have more candid. If the person says, no, I am not okay, which is really funny because if you were to, I would say in a lot of instances, when an neurotypical person asks you if you're okay, they don't, it's like a social thing. They're like,
Yeah.
oh, how you doing? Are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm great. They almost expect you to lie,
Yeah.
oddly enough, because there's been times where I go, no, I'm not okay. I'm actually quite terrible. Would you like to hear about it? And then it's just really awkward for them, right? And when I've spoken to autistic people and I say something along those lines, they're like, okay, tell me about it. I'm curious. And I'll tell them about it. And then they'll like legitimately listen. And then sometimes they might have some thoughtful advice on it. On whether it's touch some grass or drink some water or go see the appropriate specialist or something. But in any case, oh shoot, I lost my train of thought. This is what happens to me. And I had a really good question too about, because you were talking about, I have other questions. I don't want to lose this one. So we'll edit out any part where I awkwardly reach for what it was. Okay, you had said, Lord Almighty. My audience already knows how I am, and I get stuck. Um, you had said something about interactions. Oh, yes, I remember now. Yes. Okay, good. The relationship that you kind of describing regarding like context and details and the sort of relationship that happens within social dynamics, but also occur within interpretation of text, right? And the manner that they approach it. What's interesting about that is that the schizoid oftentimes does the same thing, but kind of in the opposite direction, right? There's a lot of context that oftentimes we feel is being missed or not discussed or we preoccupied with, that is very, very kind of meta, right? So it's like it is context, but it goes outward. Does that make sense? So in other words, it's if somebody is saying, if I'm trying to interpret someone's feelings that day, instead of trying to take into context like perhaps all the individual details of their life and what's happening with them, I would start considering things like, why do people behave with this way? Why is it that this thing bothers them? Why are there expectations regarding those things that would then cause the harm or the discomfort the person is feeling? Why isn't that being considered in their own interpretation of their individual emotions or behavior? How come they themselves are not considering the larger picture, and how it affects them and how it's actually essentially having control over their agency, and so on and so on and so forth, right? Like, and so then like a lot of the times when I hear a story, someone's telling me a story about something bad that happened, right? I'll give you my wife for an example, right? She'll tell me a story about something that bad that happened to somebody that she knows, just of somebody that she knows, right? And she'll tell me the story, and she's obviously she's not like myself. I would consider her to be very much neurotypical. She's concerned with the sort of elements of the story and the interactions, the social interactions of the people involved, and then the emotionality that it hits her with when she kind of communicates the occurrences of the not the characters but the actual people. See, in my mind they're characters sometimes, but of the actual people, and what occurred. And I get lost while she's telling me the story. Just get lost in thinking about, like, why do people behave this way? Why do people put up with this? Why wasn't this handled this way? Why are these consequences so easily that I consider to be avoidable or something? Why are these acceptable things? Why is this socially acceptable to talk about? Why can't we do something about it, even if we are not socially connected to the situation, considering that there's harm occurring? Like, so there's like all these thoughts kind of automatically pop into my head, and all this kind of context, if you know what I'm saying. And I feel like it's relatable when you say that the autistic person is essentially getting preoccupied or stuck in a variety of detail and ideas that I would say that the average person or the non-autistic person wouldn't even think to either consider, or don't see anything practical about considering,
Mhm.
right? Because that's the goal, isn't to understand. The goal is to react, I guess, or know how to appropriately react to the given situation. I don't know. I don't know if I'm just rambling. You tell me.
Okay. I've been thinking as you were talking about kind of that's why there's a big advantage in bringing English literature to psychology, because in that sense of what you take from a story, I think typical psychology would probably focus on the fact that you should take away, the message of the story. You should know what happened. You should be able to summarize it. You should know who's involved. And
Yeah, I'm
English
terrible at that
literature,
sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, English literature is the opposite almost, where it doesn't necessarily matter if you remember the set events, the narrative, the exact people involved. It's about kind of really feeling it as a real experience. That is what matters. So we called it, I think, thinking across the story. Reminds me of what you were saying, where instead of kind of just sticking with what's happening, which can be a good way to read, but if you're able to kind of go back through and think, well, hang on, that happened, so why is this happening that way? If you can kind of move through that way and start to think about things on a wider scale in that meta way, that is actually a really advantageous way of reading and thinking openly, that we would want, ideally, in that method, everybody to be able to do. But not a lot of people do. So the autistic participants, for example, I think my guess is that without social influence might have thought that way more often. Or what we saw with the autistic participants is they weren't autistic people who were autistic and had been left to be autistic throughout time. They'd grown up in very neuronormative environments where they were told this is how you do things. So almost kind of trained and pushed towards that, very linear, stereotypical way of communicating. So they were very self-conscious. Instead of freely moving through the text, it was very much like, well, how would a person want me to think about this? How would they expect me? So that kind of restricted some of that meta thinking, I think, for the autistic people. And a non-autistic person comes to mind as well, who was able to think in that way and had kind of done a lot of work on building themselves up empathetically and engaging with different kinds of minds to be able to do that. And when people can do that, we find that they're generally better able to think with other minds. So it's almost the opposite of stereotyping, because you're not thinking in this linear, neat way of everything's in boxes. You're thinking very broadly. And when people can think that way and you bring them together with somebody who has a completely different way of thinking to them, they're able to find a mutual ground easier almost, because they're so open with their thinking and so able
Yeah.
to consider different things across time.
That goes into one of my favorite subjects, but I'm going to save it to the end, which is what I often like to talk about, metacognition. So that's like one of my favorite things in the whole world. You have no idea. But I'll get into that a little later. I want to ask something a little more specific though. There was a part, because there's actual like quotes from participants in the research. And by the way, I'm going to put the PDF. It's publicly available, right? It's not, I'm
Yeah.
not like, yeah. So I'm going to put that in the description for anybody that's interested. And trust me, you're going to have people here that are interested. They're going to want to just read it themselves, probably to tell me about how my interpretations were incorrect. I'm just kidding. No, they don't do that kind of stuff. But yes, there's a quote here that kind of really caught my attention. It said, I enjoy, it was I won't say the name because I don't know. I don't feel comfortable saying people's names on here like that. But there was one of the participants said, I enjoy things retrospectively. So with my anxiety, sometimes I don't actually enjoy what I do. But then when I think back to it, I enjoyed it in retrospect, the memory of it. Right. So what's interesting to me is there are obviously factors in which that impact the manner in which information, including emotion, is being collected by the brain, right? And the way it's being reacted to. And I know that aside from, because oftentimes when people talk about autism, they bring up the sensory related issues, right? The conversation always becomes about, oh, sensory stuff, stimming, all sorts of things like that. And emotionality isn't usually something that is more commonly discussed. How in the manner in which autistic people actually both interpret and engage with their own emotions, right? And one of the most common things I hear from autistic people and advocates that are autistic is that emotions don't really occur at the same, what's the word, at the same degree or at the same time as the events that are taking place at that given moment. Oftentimes, the emotions felt about an event won't occur until much later in the day, or at a later point once all the information and everything has kind of been processed in the mind of the autistic individual, and then some of that emotion might bubble up in very potent ways at a what would be considered a non-normative time, right, when the event has ended, right? And I'm curious about one your thoughts on that, and two, how these kind of very different ways of interacting with their own emotions that autistic people have than non-autistic people, how that kind of affects the way they interact with text that is full of emotion, right? Let's just say they're reading a passage from a piece of nonfiction that is just tragic and full of just sadness and harrowing, um, how their interaction with such emotionality within text is impacted. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
That's really interesting. Really good questions. I'm kind of trying to piece together my thoughts. But I think talking to that quote, first of all, really kind of hit me hard as like,
Yeah,
wow, this
same.
person put, words to something that I've not been able to kind of explain to other people. And that's the joy of kind of being in research, that you're also kind of an advocate in it, because you get that kind of personal, like, wow, I really get where that person's coming from.
Mhm.
But I think, yeah, it's difficult, and I think it does heavily relate to the sensory experience of I can pluck like at ease a memory where I think, at the time, actually, I know objectively sensory overload took over and I was going into general overload and maybe even had a meltdown and had to manage that, which if you would have asked me there and then how I was feeling, I don't think I would have been able to get past that, because you're not going to feel great if all of that's happening to you in that moment.
Mhm.
But in hindsight, kind of after the event, you can sort of move back through the memory. Rather, it's like, I don't think I consider things as a whole, so I wouldn't say, well, that meltdown happened, so that whole thing has been affected. I would kind of be able to go back to an earlier point where that hadn't yet influenced anything, and kind of, oh, the joy of the way the grass looked in that moment, or something like really specific that felt kind of like something stored later to draw back on, as a kind of a joyful memory to hold. And that's actually the whole psychology that English literature approaches uses, is that fiction isn't just a kind of activity to look at and enjoy the way you might TV and film. It's an actual real experience in itself that you can then take with you and hold in memory and come back to and take different things from each time. And actually that's why we did the method the way we did. So people kind of had that authentic initial reaction in their questionnaire. And then we left some time before we went and interviewed them again and reread the quotes to try and get them back into that headspace, because often more comes out each time a person reflects on something they've read. And so, as you're saying, something that is very, very difficult to read, I think people in the moment can, there's also that instinct telling you to stop reading it, it's upsetting you, or it's really dark. But actually, when they come away and they're thinking back through it, they realize that there's so much packed in there that's more complex that they can use and they can draw on. And I think autistic people done really well with both, so that initial experience of reading and the recall, because they were kind of constantly looking for details and moments of feeling. But I think generally reading is almost an easier experience for autistic people to get something out of and enjoy. So thinking back across the research, so that interview I mentioned that we've done the interview study, where we kind of just asked people about the ways that they already read, it was quite clear that for most non-autistic people, reading was just a pastime. And the real social world was seen as something more valid, something that they should prioritize. You know, they would say things like, well, why would I learn from reading a fiction book? Because that's not real. I should be out there and I should be practicing.
Yeah.
And autistic people, for autistic people overall, they described it in a much different way, where it was equal, if not at times better, to the real social world. It was something that felt exactly real, where other minds they met along the way felt like friends almost. There was no distinction almost in their minds between like a character and a person that they're engaging with, and that sensory experience wasn't as strong. So you don't have to worry about things like what the weather's like, or you know, whether you can kind of control the room that you're reading in and things, which makes it something where you can go back and forth and not be heavily influenced by those kind of autistic sensory experiences that can make socialization even harder.
Yeah, and basically create more noise, more static in the interaction for because so if an autistic person reads, these are the things that occurred between these people and these are the emotions that are reflective of said thing, because of the sensory components not obviously being available to the sensory stuff. Yes, okay, so all the noise, all the static that comes from IRL social interaction doesn't occur within text, right? You're just seeing, you're being told how the events are occurring, what's happening, so on and so forth, and then you're able to just parse out that information. Okay. And what's interesting though, right, for a lot of the schizoids that I do talk to, they have a similar relationship, though for different reasons, I would say, with text, characters, story, fiction, a variety of things like that, right? They tend to want to, they have an easier time actually feeling by proxy the occurrences of the characters in a story. Right. There's a variety of reasons one can argue that is the case. One is because of like other types of noise, if you will, even psychological noise, perhaps not as much sensory, that is constantly being like intrusive to the kind of natural process of the schizoid trying to interpret what it is that's going on around them. When it's in a piece of literature, a lot of those concerns, a lot of those social preoccupations or expectations, let's say, are now not there, right? You are seeing the events unfold, and your agency is not impacting the events of what is being said or done or what is occurring, right? And but this is one thing I wanted to ask that I think was popped into my head. I think would be interesting, since you had a lot of you had these autistic people, you know, interpret pieces of fiction and nonfiction, correct? Is what would happen in your belief if you gave an autistic person an unreliable narrator?
Think so. Thinking back to an earlier study, the mice and men overcoming double empathy study that I mentioned before, we then done a second paper where we actually just analysed those reading diaries that people filled out and just saw what was happening. And a lot of autistic people kind of pointed to the character of George, who's the main character you're getting that perspective from, as the unreliable narrator.
Mhm.
I don't think any of the non-autistic people quite realised that he was an unreliable narrator and that there was room to think differently about things.
Mhm.
So the character of Lenny, who is George's friend with an unnamed disability, who he kind of positions himself as caring for, even though a lot of people argue that care is two-way.
Mhm.
The non-autistic people did not access the perspective of Lenny because it is not given to you. Lenny is spoke about through George's perspective and George's perspective only, and non-autistic people tended to take that as the perspective to have.
Yeah.
To view him through George's perspective by empathizing with George, whereas autistic people kind of pointed to the fact that he was an unreliable narrator, and then they started to imaginatively think how different events, different thoughts, different feelings might feel in Lenny's mind. And they actually kind of built up across participants this new perspective for him, which included complex thoughts and emotions that he had been denied through that unreliable narrator perspective. So yeah, I think when it comes to unreliable narrators in general, I would assume autistic people are more likely to
Pick up on it,
other
like,
perspectives and to notice that it
mhm.
is one way of thinking rather than an objective truth.
Interesting. That's fascinating. Because I love pieces of literature in which an unreliable narrator is being presented. Especially you know, if the narrator becomes further like discovered by the reader as the story progresses, right? You're right. I would even assume that things like contradictions and would be picked up a lot
Yeah.
easier by autistic people, right? Like if the narrator is telling a story and actively says certain details, and then those details change um through the course of the book, that's going to trigger some red flags, right? That's just going to be like, what's happening here? Well, why did, but that doesn't match up with what was said here, and so on and so forth. And then there's going to have to be interpretations of what that means and why that is occurring, right? So that's really, and so because of this kind of this emphasis on detail, then yes, they would be able to pick up really interesting insights into what perhaps even the author was intending to do, or insights into like the author's sort of intentional sort of intentionally written contradictions, right? It's like, is this a mistake, right? Is this a continuity problem, or is this an intentional contextual change, right? And so yeah, that's interesting to think about, because I would say that I would say in my case sometimes I would be kind of bad at that, as far as like being able to sense when the information has been contradicted at some point or another later, because I'd be so concerned or more preoccupied with the kind of meta narrative that is being conveyed and the ideas that are being explored, right? And things like that, and then I would start applying that to my own life, and so on and so forth. So but anyway, I do want to keep going down the list here, because I do have a lot of questions and we don't have an infinite amount of time. I do want to ask you about your opinion on something fun. So uh, I had a buddy of mine, close buddy. He's autistic, but is also has considers themselves to have a lot of these skits. Because I know a lot of autistic people that have what they consider themselves these kind of schizoid adaptations. But that their sort of cognitive style is very much autistic. And this friend of mine went through your research very, very deeply. And they had a blast going through it, by the way. And their interpretation, and their interpretation of a lot of this stuff was that you had that honestly, the interpretations that were being kind of reflected in the research were on the money. And but the one thing he wanted me to ask, and this was funny too, because I told him, hey, read this PDF, it's only like 15 pages. And if you come up with any questions from your perspective, please give them to me, right? And it was so funny. He had a list of questions in his mind, and then you answered all of them. Or the research answered most of them, all the pertinent ones, because he was like, okay, these are my questions, and then like, okay, and he would tell me like, oh, this one got answered, this one got answered, this one got answered, and then by the end he was like, all my questions got answered. I don't have questions for you, Angst. I'm like, okay, well, they're like, sorry for being useless in this experiment of getting the autistic guy to read the autistic research and then come up with questions. But the one question that he did have was, what are your thoughts on how much he was reacting to and relating to not just the research, but the manner in which the participants were reacting to the very research they were participating in that were autistic, right? So he said, he was telling me that's so meta in my mind, like I'm being validated, or I'm relating to, and I'm understanding the perspectives of someone reading literature through my perspective, because that's how they approach literature, right? They're very, very much introspective about the manner in which they already kind of think, right?
Mhm.
And so they already had a very strong sense of how they interact, or what the relationship with fiction was, right? They'll they've talked about it extensively with me. And so to read research in which these participants that might not be as introspective about how they themselves interact with the research, to read that the interpretations of the researchers were actually similar to his own conclusions about his own experience with literature. um how does it make you feel to hear that? I mean, because it's interesting, right? He It's like you guys parsed out via this research some discoveries that he did on his own about his relationship with fiction. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but he wanted me to share that. So
Yeah, that feels absolutely fantastic, because I think the terrifying thing with qualitative research
mhm.
is everybody else gonna read it, so that doesn't, feel right to me. Um, so that's really good. In terms of the question, I just want to make sure I've understood correctly. Does he mean the way that the participants have changed or influenced their reading and their reflections because it was research in itself?
No, it was more like reading. It was both, sort of. He was saying reading the reactions the autistic participants had to the questions that were being posited. He both related to and understood the context of how they were interpreting the literature themselves, and also the idea of trying to convey things about themselves in the context of being in a research situation, right?
Yeah.
Both the way they answered the questions with the context in mind was incredibly relatable, or understood by him as is his own process. And I guess for him, it was pretty interesting because he didn't think anyone ever did research on this until he read it, right? You have no idea. He spiraled hard, because he spent, I think he stayed up till like 4 in the morning reading it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, because like he spent, I think, a good, I don't know, 6 hours on it, on just the 14 pages. And it's really funny because like he would get back to me and he'd be like, okay, I'm done with 2 more pages. These are my findings. And then like I would get like a couple of like things, and then 2 hours later it'd be like, all right, I'm almost there. I'm 75% in, right? Because he was just like being very methodical, and I loved it, and I love that. And so part of his own kind of research into your research actually is what helped me kind of culminate some of the ideas I wanted to present here and discuss. So thanks to him for giving me ideas. But sorry, I already lost the question for you. Oh, God
Okay.
damn.
I think I understand a bit better that it's not just that they were kind of reading and reacting, but having to then introspect and answer that in a
Yeah.
research context. And I think it's hard because it's something you always have to hold in mind when you do any research, but I think especially reading research, because especially if you're using something like classic literature, I think it's quite heavily associated when it shouldn't be with like prestige and having to interpret a certain way.
Right.
So that then influences kind of what people start to think about or what they tell you. Autistic people, I think, spoke more freely than the non-autistic people. So there was a lot of kind of natural explorations that were happening and coming through the data regardless. But I know, so the example that comes to mind was there was a paper sandwiched between this paper and the double entry paper where we looked at the diaries. I think I said that before, repeating myself now.
It's all right. I do it all the time.
One of the autistic participants I remember kept kind of trying to interpret the question we'd asked in the research diary and putting a disclaimer to say, I can only kind of answer this from my own perspective. I don't know exactly what your question means. And would then kind of start to explore his own thoughts and eventually gradually became confident with trusting his own instinct in that and not thinking too much about what we wanted or what we might be looking for. And I think the more we kind of, that became part of the research where we started to think about why are some people, especially some autistic people, quite concerned with what we'd like them to say or what we're looking for. And that related heavily to living in a society where people always have agendas socially and there's a right way to do something and there's a wrong way to do something.
Yeah, that's my world too, trust.
And so that particular participant, if kind of we looked through his data, was recently diagnosed, had kind of had quite a lot of stigma imposed and told kind of how to think and feel quite a lot, whereas people who had maybe been diagnosed for quite a while and had more experience trusting their own thoughts and feelings and kind of exploring those introspectively were much more open and thought much less about what we might be thinking or looking for, or what they might put forward in the research. The method that we use, the English literature method, involves kind of reading participants' data as if it's a text. And you kind of mark things that really make you feel something or spark something in you, and you start to connect ideas over time, kind of like as if you're thinking across the text. So by doing that, we try to focus more on the things that felt authentically like a reaction to the text and less like an answer that they think we might want to hear. So that was analysed separately, that stuff as sort of why might people be doing that, and that's the stuff I've mentioned. But we really tried to focus as much as we could on those natural reactions, where I think the good thing with literature is an emotion can hit you so suddenly and kind of be so overwhelming that you almost can't narrow it down into what the other person might want to hear from you because you're so excited or moved or something by what you've just read that you need to get that down. And I think that was the case for a lot of autistic people, is that they kind of wrote their responses in that quite organic way more often than not.
It's so interesting because one thing that one of the stereotypes oftentimes levied at people that are autistic as well as people that are schizoid, and like a lot of the listeners I have, is this kind of lack, that there's a lack of emotionality, there's a lack of empathy, there's a lack of so on and so forth. But the way you're describing it almost sounds like a lot of autistic people are actually, they're taking a significant amount of time to interpret how both the text is supposed to make them feel or is intended to make them feel, how they actually feel, how the characters or the context in which they are involved feel, and then how that relates back to the intention of the text and blah blah blah. Like there's so many layers of emotion being explored. That because of the outward behavior, which is seemingly dispassionate, in the views of a lot of non-autistic people, I would consider not to be myself, because I would say oftentimes the schizoid is like I said, it's the stoic sort of nature of how oftentimes we approach a lot of subject matter, is merely the process of introspection, and oftentimes the emotionality is kind of locked within all those layers of introspection and thought, but it's still there. It's not as apparent as one would assume, but it's still very much there. And I think that's something that requires a significant amount of metacognition for the neurotypical person to kind of be able to accept,
Yeah.
is that outward behavior isn't a signifier, especially in this case, of internal emotionality. So anyway, sorry, I got caught up in that a little bit. Um, Now, I wanted to bring up the double empathy problem. I wanted to know if you don't mind giving the audience a little bit of a basic general rundown of what it's supposed to be, maybe your interpretation of it or your own thoughts on it, and then how it applies to the work that you do or the work that you have done.
So, kind of before the double empathy problem was coined, the way that autistic people are thought of is that people kind of look at us and see social difficulties in everyday communication and say the autistic person doesn't know how to communicate, they don't have perspective taken. Some would go as far as to say we don't have empathy. The blame is very much put onto us, and that was pathologized. You know, it's still today part of that diagnostic criteria. And it was Damien Milton, who is an autistic sociologist, so kind of part advocate, part researcher, came up with the double empathy problem, which argues that when you see an autistic person struggling socially or behaving different socially, it's not that that person is kind of wrong or broken in some way. It's that all social interaction is dynamic. It's not something that exists within a person. Everybody has their own kind of patterns and ways of socializing. That isn't necessarily right or wrong, because there isn't one way to socialize. But when people come together, so for example, if you think of two people coming together, kind of how they navigate that interaction, how well that flows, and they can kind of understand one another and move through difficulties, depends on both of those individuals having a mutual understanding. And what it argues is that for an autistic person being brought together with a non-autistic person, and this probably does differ for a non-autistic person who's neurodivergent, but I'll come to that later on. But say someone who's quote unquote neurotypical and somebody who's autistic, so they interact, and what tends to be happening is that the autistic person is trying to meet that person at least halfway. So it's trying to kind of find a rhythm, find a mutual understanding. And the non-autistic person in that situation is sort of trying to operate in the way that they do ordinarily in their everyday situation. So that fast-paced, kind of scripted ways of thinking and talking. And the autistic person obviously is approaching it from a different pattern, a different style of communication. So often what happens then is the two people struggle to understand one another, struggle to kind of access imaginatively the other person's perspective and to move the conversation forward. And that's where you start to see difficulties in like carrying the conversation forward or in thinking and feeling through something together. And then you get kind of communicative breakdowns. You also get the fact that for what we call neurotypical person, there are problems with that term, but just to use it here for now. In their everyday lives, they're constantly interacting with people who think a lot like them. Their cognition is very similar, their patterns of socializing are very similar. Yes. So when they talk to somebody who's, for example, autistic, then that person's incorrect, that person's the wrong one, because this is my safe social style, it always works, and all of a sudden it's not. So the double empathy problem argues that we need to be looking at that dynamic interaction and getting both people to open up and change their social patterns, which there's a lot of work to show autistic people are already doing that naturally. But non-autistic people, because of that lack of exposure to different minds, or not necessarily,
or minds like their own,
they tend to kind of just impose their own social pattern and ways of thinking about things. In terms of my work, I think so the double empathy problem's been very popular. It's received a lot of attention. And I should specify in relation to kind of your interest. So my interpretation is that the double empathy problem can happen between any two individuals. Doesn't matter what the neurotype is or
Yep.
what their experiences are.
That would explain why you can have two neurotypical people with similar life experiences, and then suddenly they're able to empathize with one another to far greater degrees merely because of similar backgrounds, sometimes even similar trauma. Right. So, but anyway.
From my own research, I feel this kind of typical social pattern that we've become so used to in Western society is it's learned. It's something that is kind of passed down. It's not as if everybody's born with the same social pattern that we should all be sticking to so naturally. I think any two people can deviate from that, can have that difficulty. Damien Milton, however, focuses much more on autistic and non-autistic people, and I think that's just because autistic people have long kind of been misunderstood in that way and faced a lot of scrutiny that's not been accurate. In my work so far, so in my PhD work, what we tried to do was see if we kind of acknowledge the fact that people enter a social interaction with their own preconceptions and agendas. We try as hard as possible to enter them on a level playing field what will happen. So we looked at kind of different methods that would assist that. Obviously, nobody's going to come in completely neutral, but how can we create a space that feels so open and so creative that they can come in and start imaginatively trying to build something together rather than imposing their own ways of thinking. And that's where we experimentally decided to go with the method of reading together. So there was the whole double empathy paper on that, which explored the changes that happen kind of interactionally between people over time by having this creative space where they are, instead of kind of thinking about agendas and specific social situations, or moving through a new imaginative space together. And so what we found is that reading in that context was a space to start from that was mutual for both parties. They both read that text, they both operated in that space and experienced it and felt it. And that gave them a starting point where initially they still felt quite different to one another. But by sort of feeling with the characters and with the situations and reflecting on that through kind of organic, spontaneous lived experience sharing that came up in that interaction, they started to feel for and with one another much more than they ordinarily would, and through a much more open perspective that wasn't them imposing their own standardized ways of thinking about things, because the literature had opened that right up and encouraged them to kind of hold more things in mind and think more broadly about things than they might in a typical everyday social situation. And I think the next stage certainly needs to be an exploration of what happens when it's not just an autistic person and a non-autistic person. You know, how does this apply to other groups? So there's a lot of research that shows autistic spaces, autistic people kind of interact in quite a similar pattern more often than not, and they have an easier time creating mutuality and getting kind of on the same wavelength as one another for interaction. So I suppose as a researcher, my interest is what then happens if it's autistic people with other divergent minds. Would that still be a kind of unique shared space where there's more understanding and more creativity and movement? Which I definitely think.
Oh yes. I can vouch for that because like I said, a lot of the people that I interact with on a daily basis, some of them are autistic, some of them are not, some of them have PTSD, some of them are ADHD, some of them don't. There's a lot of divergency occurring, but it's kind of funny in there. One of the things that allows many of them to sort of break, I guess, that empathy issue is even if like they're not always aware it's occurring, is because of similar struggle, similar apprehension toward having agency removed, having being misunderstood, being misinterpreted. uh I would say if we were to compare to like schizoids and autistic people as far as like priorities are concerned, oftentimes catness or honesty, truthfulness, sincerity, integrity are incredibly important components in order to create an environment in which they feel safe or comfortable around the other person, right? But definitely consistency and integrity of information, right? Like I prefer a person tell me, I don't really like the things you like, and I don't really like your company. I'd rather not be around you. I would just be perfectly fine. I'd just be like, okay. I wouldn't have a need to rectify that, and then I would just move on, and then I would no harm, no foul. It's just I put more value in that honesty, in that not wasting the other person's time with lies and nonsense, in my opinion. Um, and so I find that to be a very common ground between an autistic person and a schizoid, is that both parties, even though their reasons might be quite different, right? I would say in the case of the schizoid, oftentimes it would be interpreted as a almost philosophical difference, right? Because they're always generally more stuck in the abstract. Um, they um, they would find common ground there because it'd be like, well, I have no philosophical reason to be dishonest with you, and you have no, I guess, what would be logical reason or practical reason for being dishonest with me, and even like it causes both of us harm to be dishonest and make up things and play social games that are confusing and don't makes too much sense to us. That communication is then facilitated to be a lot easier. And yeah, and I mean I agree that a lack of mutual methods of communication is going to lead to a distrust of the other individual and their, well, their, like you said, their agenda, their their just goals. And it's going to be a lot more difficult for the other person to interpret said things, and without that context it's far more difficult to empathize with who you're communicating with, right? Because you don't know, you won't know what exactly matches, doesn't match, what's being interpreted correctly, incorrectly, uh, what, so on and so forth. And this sort of thing that is discovered that occurs between autistic people as far as empathy goes when they're around each other enough, and then they, a certain safety comes from it, as far as communication goes. And schizoids undergo very, very similar thing, though I guarantee you most of them will deny it as it's occurring, for other reasons. But in the server that I created, I basically have amassed, I guess, most of them are lurkers because that's just the nature of it. But even the lurkers message me saying that just viewing the interactions and such that do occur between the schizoids that aren't lurking, that are more just, I guess, proactive in their attempts to communicate, have been doing very, very good things for them. Because as far as empathy goes, right? Because a lot of schizoids will walk around thinking, "Oh, I don't have empathy. I was either diagnosed schizoid, or I'm fairly sure I don't empathize with people about so many things, the things I'm supposed to empathize about." Right? I'm not empathizing about the things that I'm supposed to empathize about, and so I must have no empathy. Right? Meanwhile, if I talk to that same person and through my own lens, I ask them questions about their ethics, their ideas, how people should be treated, how people should not be treated, right? Even though they won't, convey very much emotion a lot of time, the process itself internally on how they came to those conclusions is incredibly emotional. And oftentimes they themselves aren't aware of it because they had just gone under the assumption that something like emotional decision making was lost to them, or something that they lacked, or something that they didn't possess like a normal person, right? And that's another thing that's really tragic. And even reading this research is that there are individuals, that participants that are autistic in your work, um, in your colleagues' work, that were essentially saying things that sounded very similar to what I hear a lot of schizoids say about themselves, right? A constant sort of self-gaslighting almost that occurs because all they have as a point of reference is how the world interprets their behavior. And so until they have others like them that interpret their behavior in ways that they had internally thought to be incorrect, right? Assumptions about like how do I put that? It's such a confusing way to put it. The stuff that maybe in youth they might have decided was true that they later decided is not about themselves because the external world kept bombarding them with literature or ideas about who they are. And then it all like a lot of that stuff gets kind of pulled back up again. It's like, wait, I thought I already concluded that this thing about me is bad or wrong or incorrect, but now you're telling me that it's not, and you're a person that experiences this, and so now I have validation, and so now I have to reinterpret or reanalyze my previous interpretation, right? And it's something they can't do until they interact with someone with a similar mindset, a similar cognitive style. It's just not going to happen, right? And yeah, I just find that incredibly relatable. Your work and what you're doing here is exactly like literally this research right here is the type of research that I think needs to be done with people on the schizo spectrum.
Mhm.
The same exact thing, because these problems with double empathy, these problems with constant having to mask, constant having to be incredibly introspective of how they behave around others, what's expected of them, and then still not even having a full understanding, especially emotionally, of why such expectations even have to occur or exist. They just know they do. Um, yeah, all that stuff is incredibly relatable to this non-autistic, right? And that's what's so funny too, because I'm not autistic, yet I'm understanding so much of this struggle, right? So but anyway, I went off meandering here. That was my time to ramble on forever and say nothing. So just to kind of start going toward more kind of practical things, like real world things in regards to the research. What sort of myths regarding autistic people do you think this type of work, if it continues to be done, this sort of research continues to be done, and maybe even bigger, bigger scope, more participants, so on and so forth, variety of literature. What do you think some of the myths regarding autistic people are going to be, I guess, or stigma? Let's just say that some of the stigma regarding autistic people that can maybe be debunked or finally put to rest over time.
So it became a little bit kind of matter in my head as I was writing it, because obviously when you're writing up a paper of findings on any kind of research about a minority group, you always have to consider how you put that together and how a person with the worst kind of stigma or stereotyping about that group is going to think about it. You know, are they going to shut down and think, well, I just don't agree, or is there something you can do in your writing to make them stick with it and kind of just listen to you whilst you talk and then see if they agree at the end? But then I started to kind of think back to the method we'd done and what the literature itself was doing. So those fictional texts were kind of those moments that stumped people and moved people. And I suppose I started to try and see the research as if it were a fictional text. What parts would move people in a similar way? How could we kind of hope that a reader who is stigmatizing might be moved to open up their minds, as they might be by fiction in itself?
Feel safe with the research being done.
Yeah.
I would even say.
So that was kind of part of, including the quotes is quite a normal thing for qualitative research, but that's where it really came into its own with this method, is that instead of kind of just reading about a summary of the findings, you're getting that language that came through instantly and being able to kind of read that as a kind of a piece of text in itself to be moved by and to feel with. So my hope is that a reader who thinks, for example, that we can't empathize will be so moved by those pieces of text included where people have very clearly accessed such an emotional depth, or that even better, that person will say something that hits them and feels like, wow, I really get where that person has kind of come from, that kind of moves them out of that research and narrow-minded way of thinking about things. I think kind of importantly, it really shakes up that narrative that autistic people can't introspect and don't know their own mind, and that we kind of just don't understand social situations because it approaches it from such a different angle that it shows that when you do that, you see the value that wasn't there through that original way of thinking and feeling about things. It's hard because the biggest issue with that is that the kinds of people with power and who think quite stereotypically and stigmatize about autistic people would not necessarily pick up a paper like mine. So you kind of know that it's going to be like-minded people who are most likely to pick that up and be interested in what you're saying and how you're saying it. Which is where I think opportunities to kind of just introduce people to that research are really helpful. And students as well. So students are people who are quite important to impart research on because they're at that beginning of the journey where they're starting to think about and form their own ideas about things and trying to make sure they think as openly as possible rather than picking up a book that tells them autistic people can't socialize and should be trained or something, you know, really awful like that. I think there needs to be a much bigger shift.
That's a whole big conversation. Trained. Yeah, we can't get into that right now because that'll open up a whole can of worms. I have my personal gripes with behavioral therapies.
I am staunchly against it. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Probably shouldn't be that subjective, but I can't not speak up against behavioral.
No, you should absolutely should be against it. Anyway, at least in my subjective opinion, right? In my own righteous indignation. But this brings me to, we're nearing the end here. This brings me to, I guess, what would be considered a more controversial sort of question. I wouldn't even call it that. I think it's pretty simple. Do you think that as far as advocacy goes, when it comes to something of this degree, right? When it comes to something as a differing, I'm not sure how to word it properly, but a differing cognitive structure, right? Essentially a neurological difference of this degree, even, right? Do you think advocacy should be led by the very people who live it?
That's a really interesting question. I think something that is constantly being debated in research.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask it.
I think it most definitely should be led by people with the lived experience. I don't, like, for example, I've seen research departments where they've done what we call participatory public involvement, which is where you bring advocates in. So you've got the researchers who, you know, they've been trained how to research, but they don't have the lived experience. So you bring somebody in to lead it who has that lived experience. And that can work really well, depends if it's done properly. But I've seen departments who are researching, say, the experiences of autistic people, not of carers of autistic people, who will bring in a carer of an autistic person or a parent of an autistic person. And I think, well, that seems wildly inappropriate.
No, it's wildly inappropriate. Yeah, I don't want my schizoid experiences to be interpreted and talked about by my goddamn parents. Like, come on.
Exactly.
I'm good. That's not going to be helpful at all. I'm like, you guys. You guys did enough damage. I don't need you to try to explain away why some of the damage you did was actually good for me. So that's really interesting. So you think that there would be a benefit to having, say, someone that is autistic, is on the schizo spectrum, advocating for the very group, and then even researchers with that lived experience that went into that field doing that sort of research, right? Having autistic researchers do research on autism, right? And vice versa. Somebody might claim, oh, that's going to create some kind of bias or something that's going to be in favor of trying to create what's the word, results that would ultimately help the advocacy group that they're involved in, right? And so, and what's really funny about saying a statement like that, especially if you're talking about autistic people, is that If you have a even rudimentary understanding of what kind of motivates it, based on a lot of anecdotal stuff, but what motivates a lot of autistic people to do what they do and have the goals that they have, what's the word, lying about or something like being motivated by a social gain or a political gain of some kind, in this kind of almost what would be considered somewhat cynical way, is something that just doesn't come naturally to a lot of autistic people. I would argue, and it doesn't come naturally to a lot of schizoid people either. It just seems uh, I don't know how to explain it, but that's for another talk. So yeah, I would agree with that for sure, because there's just so many motivations that a person that is neurotypical would have, regardless of the intention, even if it's entirely noble.
Mhm.
In their mind, the interpretation of what are good results and what are good intentions would differ greatly in the mind of the very people they're advocating for, especially if they're not taking the time to listen in a very kind of open manner. And oftentimes, even in a situation like you described, in which researchers that are not autistic are interacting with people that are, they might have their own preconceptions in regards to their research on how to interpret the very lived experience that the autistic person is conveying, right? So if you think, oh well, autistic people interpret information as such, then you're gonna and that assumption is incorrect. When you hear their lived experience, you're not going to take it for what it's being explained as. You're going to take it through the lens of how they interpret or information or things that are being experienced, right? You're going to look at their behavior and just assume that the lack of affect means a lack of emotional consideration, or so on and so forth, right? So is that kind of what you're saying occurs in some of these sort of kind of.
Yeah, so kind of my opinion is quite an extreme one, that I don't think research should ever be done without at least one person, ideally more, on the team who represents the minority group of interest, whatever that group is.
Yeah.
Um, because data, whether it's numbers, whether it's words, has to be interpreted. And if that's being interpreted through a lens that doesn't add up with that perspective, then that becomes a problem. And the data, the interpretations all become very inaccurate and start to lead more stigmatized understandings. I think so. My research was mixed. We had autistic and non-autistic people. I went a step further and actually brought in autistic people who were not yet at that point researchers per se. They'd not had the research training. So I think whether you're autistic or not, and whether even if you've got, like, for example, a whole autistic team and there isn't a mixed team for whatever reason, researchers are trained quite heavily in being ethical and doing things properly. So I don't think there's ever a concern about agendas as long as the researcher is doing their job properly. But your job as the researcher is to bring in those other voices and let people kind of, without any research agendas, without any kind of priorities about academia, because I was conscious, for example, with my research, this was my PhD, I really cared about this. This was like something that was so precious to me that I needed somebody else who really didn't give a damn that it was a PhD to come in and to say, this design would work well, this is how I've interpreted the data, because that to me was a much more organic autistic response to things that were happening than my own. I think the problem is that not everyone is aware of their biases. A lot of people want to pretend that they are objective because they're a researcher, and they should be. I think that's a myth. I think all
Absolutely.
science means having to accept the biases you're going in with and trying your best
You
to
get
make that
better research if you go into it accepting the biases that you possess.
exactly.
Mm.
So I do think the way forward is to make sure people are included, but done properly, not in a tokenistic way where you bring them in and you listen to them and then you don't factor in anything that they've advised. I think you have to, if somebody says something that doesn't add up with what, so it happened to me where I didn't necessarily agree with the other researchers on some minor things about the way things should be done. And then the people I brought in as autistic advocates they kind of spoke my own mind about they didn't agree with how the plan was going ahead
Yeah.
for design. And it's about not moving forward until everybody is happy. And that can be really, really difficult, but that is the only way to do it properly, rather than saying, well, I'm just going to stick with these people because I think they're always better, or, well, I'm just going to go with exactly what you're saying because that's the new information that's coming.
No, of course, of course. I mean, I wouldn't say, I personally wouldn't go with happy. I would go with understood.
Yeah.
Or not misinterpreted. Because happy, for me, that's just a whole cacophony of problems. Happy doesn't equal what's the word, accurate. So
No. Comfortable maybe is a better word,
yeah,
where
maybe,
nobody
maybe.
feels as if something is being doing wrong, or like
Yeah.
everybody feels comfortable that it will be the best for all parties the way that you've decided to move forward. And that can really slow down research as well, but I think it has to be done, and we need more training, I think, for people to
Because ultimately, if you don't do
understand
that,
physics
you're
properly.
going to end up with results. It's like, oh, we got done with the research, but if it has all these problems and holes in it, well, what's
Yeah.
the point of the results, right? Now you're just faultier. You're always going to have some fault in the results, but now you're just going to have even faultier results with less things factored in and less elements. And then that's how you end up with what is it called? That section at the bottom of the paper that goes, oh, these are the million things we didn't take into consideration that next time someone else does it, they should take into consideration, right? It's like, why didn't you just take the time to take some of that stuff into consideration to begin with? That might have been good. Instead of passing the buck essentially to whoever picks it up next. But maybe that's just me asking for too much. Do you think that kind of bridging the gap between different kinds of neurodivergent groups, whether it's the schizo-spectrum people I work with, the autistic people you work with, even other types of neurodivergence, do you think sort of working together and communicating beyond those kind of sort of individual niche group lines can create a stronger sort of it can mutually help all involved essentially, or do you think it is better to have them sort of in their own isolated departments advocating for their own individual
I mean,
what?
I think generally the less that we narrow down the groups, better. So the more people included, the better that is. Obviously there will always be kind of facets of a particular group where there's so for example, like sensory difficulties maybe wouldn't be advocated by every neurodivergent group. I think it's a hard one. I've encountered people who really hate my work because they think they are really sick and tired. I really empathize with that, of having to interact with people who don't respect or understand them, and they don't want to learn how to meet halfway with non-neurodivergent people. I think
Yeah, there's a lot of resentment there that I completely understand and empathize with.
yeah, I think as a researcher we have to explore both. We have to explore the people who want to or need to be in those mixed interactions. How can we make that better? How can we kind of bring divergent and non-divergent people together? But I think there's also a huge importance in diverse spaces, divergent spaces. So I don't think that necessarily needs to be, say, an autistic space, because that carries the assumption that just because a few people are autistic, they're going to all have something great in common. I think it's much more about the pattern of experiences that matters most, maybe. So
Yeah.
thinking back to what you mentioned earlier about how you'll speak to somebody else who has maybe started to hold this belief of I can't empathize because I've been told that my whole life, and then you speak and there's this discovery process that happens. I think that can happen across conditions because conditions are arbitrary and we've created them. I think patterns of difference is maybe the best way to think about it. So bringing people together with similar experiences, similar social cognition patterns, who maybe have shared interests in particular things. I think that's probably the better way for that to go in the long term.
And something to mention is that, like, just because I can empathize with other schizoids, or autistic people can empathize in some regards with other autistic people, doesn't mean they're gonna like each other.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll tell you that right now. I know plenty of autistic people that say, Oh, I get where he's coming from, but I think he's annoying. I don't like him. And then it's like, you know what I'm saying? Like there's plenty of schizoids out there that I find annoying and I don't like. But I empathize with the struggle. I empathize where they're coming from. And even when I disagree with a stance or a belief or a thought on something, um, that's subjective, I still understand where they're coming from with that. It's not the lack of, there's no lack of comprehension, like, or there's less comprehensional sort of difficulty on my part in understanding where they're coming from when they make the decision that they do, that disagree with, or otherwise, if that makes sense. So I'm curious to how autistic people, because I haven't seen too much of it, but how autistic people interact with each other when they don't like each other. And I think that's something important to look at too, right? Like, what causes an autistic person not to like another autistic person? Because if you remove the factor of a lot of these cognitive differences and social concerns and all this sort of stuff, and you're just dealing with a person you can interact with, I'm curious to what their definition of someone they don't like would look like. Someone that they don't like that's like them. I think I know it sounds silly, but I think there's something important in kind of asking that question, because then it really kind of humanizes the whole thing, in my opinion. Right? Like I don't, that's one thing I've always had an issue when it comes to like allyship stuff and advocacy of stuff, is this kind of like tribalistic aspect that it comes with, like, oh, we're all this, so we all must like each other. It's like, no, 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 people don't like each other sometimes, and people do like each other sometimes. Some people hate each other sometimes, and all those elements need to be taken into consideration when trying to like advocate, I think, for any group, including autistic ones. But I think I'm gonna get in trouble for talking too much on this one. Hey, Carp, edit out any kind of redundant bullshit, please, that I say throughout this, and then because it was probably not useful. Thank you, Carp. Okay, so what future goals do you have for your own research and where you're going to take things? And then just for the audience, tell them a little bit as far as like where they could find your Twitter or what it's under, or if you have a website or Linktree or anything like that that you'd like to share.
Thank you. In terms of kind of, sorry, did you ask me what future directions? And there's thunder going on, so I'm getting really distracted right now.
No, okay, both things. I wanted you to just kind of have basically say a brief thing about how, like, oh, where do you hope your research is going to now take you, or, and then also kind of just chill yourself. That's what I'm asking you to do. Yes.
I think in terms of where the research will go, you touched upon earlier the mention of the problematic way that people think about high function and low function autism, and I don't ascribe to that at all, but I do ascribe to a more dynamic explanation that we all have different support needs for different things, and that can change it within a person across time and place, or it can vary across people. So me in one situation with another autistic person next to me, we're going to have very different support needs to one another in that situation. That being said, there are autistic people with particular experiences that tend to get cut out of research. So autistic people who don't communicate verbally are a huge group that just often don't get researched. And autistic people who have like intellectual disability, as they're known as, learning disability, they're often kind of either not included or it's not explored how their disability impacts their experiences. And I think I'm really interested in seeing different creative methods for social inclusion for those groups. So there's something called the Poetry Explorer app, which one of my colleagues, Phil, who was on the research team, has created, where instead of having to verbally discuss a piece of text, you can kind of point literally to different parts and connect things together and work with another person to do that mutually. I'm currently working on a research project that is evaluating a pre-existing music and mental health program in the UK. And that's kind of been a lot of food for thought for how music in creating a space, a physical space to embody, could help people to connect through nonverbal means, and actually does
Hmm.
anything help people to connect through
Yeah.
nonverbal means. So I'm interested in exploring those different methodologies, those different ways to connect people, but also, as we've touched upon a lot, in bringing together divergent minds who aren't necessarily all autistic. So, for example, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, and then branching out into mental health as well. So, I know there's a lot of debate going on currently about term neurodivergent and what that should encompass. And I think that's getting
Yeah,
brought
yeah.
up.
I get wanting to make it broad. I agree with you, but it's just like there's some stuff that I would argue is just so one actually can have such an impact on the manner in which you interpret reality, and then another one affects a specific function, or like, so it's difficult for me to say compare dyslexia to autism,
Yeah,
only because one is affecting something and certain aspects that are important and are a note, but it's not like the fundamental way in which you interact with reality. That's a little more intense. So, but
you're
anyway.
completely right. But I think it's those kind of explorations that will help us to move things forward and to understand things a little bit better about specific kind of double empathy problems. So, for example, whether dyslexic people are maybe, have an easier time when it's like a standardized way of communicating with somebody, or whether they have an easier time in a neurodivergent space, and what influences that kind of thing. And research is showing exactly what you're saying, that I think conditions like dyslexia, they may influence the way that perception is within everyday life, but that it is much more kind of in relation to educational settings or learning environments. So
Of course.
I think understanding the double empathy problem better with more groups rather than it being split into just two autistic, non-autistic
Yeah.
people would be really interesting. And I think as well who identifies as neurodivergent, because I know a lot of dyslexic people don't, but some do, and they think that the way that their brain interacts with the world is completely different as a result
Oh,
of
okay.
that.
I haven't heard enough research on that. I haven't actually discussed had that conversation. Now I know where to look next. I'm gonna start hitting up dyslexic people to get a better understanding of the depth of dyslexia, and that maybe it reaches beyond merely reading or education. Interesting. Oh, did you say your Twitter handle, or is there
Oh,
anything?
sorry, I completely forgot. So my Twitter handle is just at Melissa Chapple, I think. I'm pretty sure.
I'll put the link at the bottom.
Yeah, I don't have a website, but all of the research that we've spoken about today is available. There's either kind of my thesis, which puts everything together with more context, or they're available as individual PDF papers. And I think all of them are now freely available, I think. And the best way to find that is probably through ResearchGate. And if there's anything on there that is not immediately freely available, you can put in a request to me, and then I can
Oh, I
forward
was
papers
I
on to
was
people.
actually going to say, if you could link to, if they are freely available, if you could send me links to them, to maybe the two major pieces of research that we kind of discussed today, and then I can put those in the description for anybody that's interested in looking. I'll also put your Twitter on there as well, just in
Thank
case I decide to follow you and see where you take things, especially. Okay, unless there's anything else you want to mention or I wanted to mention, I think we're good. Okay,
you. That was
we're
great. Thank
we're
you.
good. All right. Let me